Khadija, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, thank you so much, Lydia, for having me. This is, I'm sure this is going to be a really interesting conversation for me, and I'd love to learn more also about what you guys are doing at DEFI. It sounds very, very exciting from the little that I've heard. Just on me, I'm currently the founder and CEO of a program called Teach for Pakistan. And this is a program that has been adapted from the Teach First and Teach for America programs that have existed for a long time. And so now I've been in this work for about 10 years. Many years ago, when I was a much younger student in grad school, is when I first stumbled upon the model in the US. And it just inspired me so much, an idea that we're going to create a platform that exists to bring our country's best young talent into solving for our most difficult problem, which to my mind is educational inequity. And I think the real thing that inspires me about this work is the idea that, a lot of people talk about change and many components and inputs into change, but very few people ask the question of where is the human power, the energy going to come from that's going to drive change, and how are we going to cultivate and find those people, which is, I think, what a program like Teach for Pakistan does. And so essentially what we do, for anybody who doesn't know the Teach for model, is that we recruit annual cohorts of our country's best young talent, so graduating students and then young professionals. And then we provide them the opportunity and support and training to be able to teach for 2 years in low-income schools. Our priority is to work with public schools. And the idea is that in those 2 years, they will go above and beyond in their work with the kids who they're teaching, and in partnership with the parents in the community, with the other teachers and the school principal, and really try and drive kids, really accelerate their growth towards transformational, not just academic outcomes, but also personal growth outcomes. But also in the same process, because ultimately this is a leadership development program for the young people who do this work, they're learning a lot about this system that they've only so far sat on the outside of and critique. They understand what are the dynamics of poverty and what are the difficulties that are created, what are the systemic kind of challenges that have continued to ensure generation upon generation that kids are just not learning the way that they should be learning, and not enough of them are in schools the way that they need to be in schools. And so that's a very small summary of what Teach for Pakistan does and is set up to do.
That's great. So I'm just wondering, in your view, what is the role of education technology and innovation in your work, as well as in addressing systemic issues in education in Pakistan?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question, Lydia. And my view is that answering that question is actually should be, well, that question I think would be answered by another question, which is how can technology best support educators and learners in some of the most challenging contexts where we work, right? And so I think contextually speaking, Pakistan is a country where that's a critical consideration to keep in mind when thinking about what is the potential of education technology today. 5-10 years time, we'll make the necessary investments, but today. And so I think in that context, there's a few things that do come to mind. The first is, I think education technology has enormous power in being able to enable systems, particularly public school systems, to develop, train, support their teachers. And I think part of that, some of those are solutions that your center actually is already testing out. I think the idea, for instance, of being able to connect teachers to communities of practice that include teachers from across the world, so that they can take more charge of their own learning and map out their own learning journeys more independently, and start to find resources in the form, whether that's in the form of materials or videos, or in the form of just help and support from colleagues around the world who are facing similar problems. I think that's an incredible idea. So So I think that's a really huge, potentially a game changer. The question of how can edtech be used to grow and support teachers. I think the other role where the other place where edtech can play a really big role is, I feel like one thing that teachers in our context often struggle with a lot is really diagnosing a child's every child's own learning level, and then being able to teach them where their starting point is that, right? So for various reasons our systems are set up in a way that very often kids will pass from one grade to another, uh, even if they've not mastered the kind of knowledge and skills and habits that they ought to have by the previous grade level. And so the learning loss and the learning gap just kind of accumulates over time until you find that, a child is in 8th grade and really in some cases can't even read and write. And so, and I think that part of the problem there is being able to effectively and really clearly diagnose where a child is at, and be able to use that data to then inform your teaching practice to be able to differentiate. And so I think that's a problem where technology and edtech solutions can really play a role, because they can help us develop those individualized kind of learning journeys for kids.
I really appreciate your idea of like the teachers and technology partnership, that technology is not used as like, oh, you have a problem here, here's the solution, but rather how can technology support teacher to do their job better? Because teacher ultimately is a person who is delivering the teaching and supporting the students. So I really appreciate that idea. Um, so, um, so what do you think are some exciting future or new education models in the current digital age?
When I think about new education models, Lydia, or innovations in education models, or how education is sort of set up to function, honestly, I think the stuff that excites me is really what seems contextually most relevant, right, to us. And there's two that I wanna talk about a little bit. I think one is what we've seen happen through COVID. I think it's really opened up a world of opportunity that we were just not seeing before. And in that, traditionally we've seen um, in Pakistan and possibly many other places around the world, that teaching or education has become the domain of the school, and the parent and the community has really kind of been shut out of that process. And particularly in low income, I mean, I know that this is not new information for you at all, but in low income communities, especially, I think that division between school on the one hand and community on the one hand, with the parents kind of being firmly locked out, is really deeply rooted, and it stands quite firm. And as a result of that, parents have become very disconnected from a child's teaching and learning process, and often feel very intimidated by the school and any kind of learning processes, because they feel like they're not capable of being able to participate in that at all. And so I think the interesting thing that we saw happen with COVID, for instance, was that now when our teachers were trying to do remote or distant learning, with students in such difficult and challenging community circumstances, what they found was that there had to be a very heavy reliance on the parent, which led to these incredible new partnerships developing, and the parent playing a real role as an educator. So the teacher is not the only educator now in this case. The parent is just as much a vital facilitator of learning for this child than they'd ever been before. And so and I'll give you examples of that, right? So for instance, the simple act of a teacher sending an assignment, whether that's a video to be watched or something to be read, or a task to be completed, and the parent reading it themselves first, understanding, calling up the teacher and saying, well, what does this mean, and what does this mean, and what does this mean, getting clear on what is the criteria for getting this thing done at a good quality, then providing oversight to that child, providing them help, in the process where they can, sending that back to the teacher to say, here is what he or she has been able to produce, what do you think, right? I think that has been a really interesting thing that's happened. And I think that that's something that could completely redefine the role of the parent, in the future. Because if an educator is very serious about making, dramatic academic gains, particularly, but also non-cognitive gains with kids in a short amount of time, which I think all educators need to be doing, because we have kids we have, even in non-COVID years, we have serious learning gaps that we have to overcome for the majority of our kids. So if an educator is serious about that, then they have to maximize the sources of support and learning for their kids, and also maximize the amount of learning time that they have with their kids. And they can't do that, right? Like, how do you do that if you act like the parent and the home is just a completely different space that has nothing to do with your life? So I think, so that's a long way of saying, I think, that one powerful innovation on traditional learning models, I think that has a lot of potential and needs to be explored into the learning process. The second one, I believe, is what would happen if we, and I don't think this is all that new. I think a lot of people have been talking, experimenting about this across the world. But what I'm seeing as something that needs to now cross over from the alternative experimental domain into the traditional, is this idea that when we talk about outcomes that we want for kids, how do we prioritize some of the kind of non-cognitive outcomes in a way that those are the ones that drive the academic or learning-based outcomes. And specifically within that, I think this idea of student leadership, which I think encompasses a whole set of competencies, right? Which will go into students being able to exercise leadership. But I think if a teacher is, or if a school is really grounded in the idea of developing student leadership, then academics come along with that. But alongside that, you help kids realize that the most important thing for them to do is to be able to find what is the problem that they want to solve in the world, and be able to build on their strengths and collaborate with other people in trying to solve those problems, right? And when I take a step back and look at the world around us, I feel like that's that is the only direction in which we can go from here on, because we've already we're already in part of the we're part of the generation which, yes, we still have some problem solving ability left, but the next generation that's coming in after us is going to inherit a world where they're going to have to solve some very, very serious and grave problems, and they're going to have to solve it collaboratively, like you were saying earlier, right? I think the power of a model that connects kids from around the world is exactly that, because it's now become an existential issue. You can't It's not a good to have anymore. It is the only way that I think that the world survives. And so I think those two would be kind of the two innovations to learning models that I'm really excited about.
So what do you see as the challenges of education in the digital age, and how could DEFI Center Cambridge support this?
I see two big challenges right now. I think the first one is, we all know that our education systems across the world, including ours in Pakistan, are highly inequitable, and that means that with the digital advances that we're making as a global community, and with new opportunities that are now afforded to kids who can afford the kind of technology that can give them those that can help them take advantage of those digital advances, the very real risk is that this is going to lead to even greater inequality of opportunity than we've seen before. And so that, I think, is these questions of equality and also of equity, right? Being able to get kids, all of the kids, the same kind of opportunity, but far more importantly, being able to get kids the opportunities that they need to be able to have a fair shot at life. I think that is the most important question that advancements in education, technological advancements in education raises. And I honestly don't think that we are asking those questions. I think that it feels, and I will admit that this may be an unfair critique, but the way that I see this playing out right now, I feel like we've decided that we will innovate first and we will consider the equity questions later. And I think that's perhaps an area where DEFI can be a real voice. and put equity at the heart of all of innovation, and not say, let's just build something first and then we see how we can give poor kids access to it, right? So I think that's one. So I think the conversation on edtech needs to change in that way. One is the other problem that I see as an educator, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think that there is a real problem right now with how technology is being seen as a replacement to human beings. And I think it is, if we think about this as parents or caregivers to kids who are in our lives, we understand that children need human beings in their lives, who can nurture their growth. That's not a complicated or a unique idea, but somehow when we talk about trying to fix education systems at scale, that idea completely goes out the window and it is seen as a soft idea, that just doesn't have room in a world where we're all about trying to make sure that kids grow by 1 year or 2 years in their literacy or numeracy. And I think that that's really, honestly speaking, at one level, it's just, I think we have to step back and be honest, right? About, would we want the same for our kids, for them to have access to tablets instead of teachers, right? And I think so that's one problem um, where technology is being seen as a replacement uh, for an adult who needs to be able to facilitate learning. And I think there DeFi can play a really critical role, and it does, right? The second that you say that the thing that we want to prioritize with technology is more connection rather than less connection, right? For instance, that's a beautiful idea to me, because that's exactly what it should do. It should give kids more exposure, right? Exactly as you were saying before, these kids have tremendous potential. And when you give them access to people, they will take on the learning themselves, right? So they will absorb ideas, they will absorb energy, they will absorb like cultures, they will they'll get to all of that. So I think that's the other really big, I think, potential challenge with technology, is how to use it as a force for connection as opposed to a force for disconnection from between human beings, right? Among human beings.